Title: Shadows of Zatan'nataz. Chapter 1. A Flicker of Doubt. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the desert city of Zatan'nataz. The air was thick with the heat of the day, but even as the evening winds began to stir, the stifling weight of the city's secrets remained, pressing down on the inhabitants like the very sand beneath their feet. It was an unsettling place, its beauty deceiving in its simplicity. Behind every corner, every street, lay something darker, something the people refused to see. Joran could feel it. It was a constant hum beneath the surface of his thoughts. Something was wrong in Zatan'nataz, something he couldn't name. For years he had been a hunter, a man of the land. He knew the rhythm of the desert, knew how to track animals, how to follow the faintest trail through the shifting sands. But the city was a different kind of wilderness, and it was harder to navigate than the desert ever was. There were too many questions buried beneath its dust, too many answers no one dared to speak. He had once been a part of it, one of the people, dutiful, unquestioning, an active participant in the rituals that kept the city safe. He had stood with the others in the great square as the priests performed their sacred offerings, offering their prayers to the goddess who protected them from the demon that lived beneath the earth. He had felt the warmth of belief seep into his veins, comforted by the thought that they were watched over, that they were safe. But that was before the nagging doubts had crept in, before the whispers began to crawl inside his head, before the priest's eyes began to gleam with greed. Joran stopped in front of a temple, its grand columns rising like silent sentinels. The high priests, those who held the power of the ritual, had just completed the monthly ceremony, presenting the demon's heart to the pit of Zakas. They spoke of the goddess who would rise, of her eternal protection. The crowds had dispersed, but Joran lingered, staring at the temple, his thoughts scattered like leaves in the wind. He could still hear the chants of the priests echoing in his mind, their hollow words reverberating in his skull. The goddess is our salvation. She is our protector. Is she? Joran thought. Or is she just another lie? The people had been told that the goddess defeated the demon every month, that her powers kept the city safe. But when Joran had started watching the priests more closely, something didn't add up. The way they moved, the way they spoke, too polished, too rehearsed. There was something predatory in their eyes, as though the ritual wasn't about protecting anyone at all, as if they were playing a game, pretending to be the gods, while the real demons were hiding in plain sight. He had seen the way the high priests lived, clad in rich robes, draped in jewels, never once touched by the hardships of the people. They ate the finest food, slept on silks and cushions, their every need catered to by the servants who had nothing, who would never know that kind of luxury. The people believed in them, believed in the false rituals they performed. But Joran could feel the rot beneath it all. It was in the way the priests laughed too loud, their voices too harsh. It was in the whispers behind closed doors, the promises they made to each other in shadows. It was the way the air smelled in the temple, thick, sour, stale. Joran's hands tightened around the hilt of his knife, the familiar weight of it grounding him. His mind raced as he walked through the crowded streets. He didn't know why the thought had settled so deeply within him. He had dismissed it at first, buried it beneath his daily routine, but now it was like a vine, creeping into the cracks of his thoughts, strangling his peace. The more he thought about the rituals, the more the lies seemed to spread. The priests were lying, the goddess was a myth, and the demon had never been vanquished. But what was the truth? What was the real cost of the heart? The first sign of the truth. Joran's feet led him to the edge of the city, where the desert stretched endlessly in all directions, a sea of sand that seemed to mock the walls of stone and marble the city had built. He had spent enough time out here, in the wilderness, to understand the subtle ways of nature. The world beyond the walls of Zatan'nataz was simple. It was clear. The wind told its stories through the rattling of dry branches, the scuttling of small creatures beneath the dunes, and the way the earth shifted beneath his boots. But in the city was a labyrinth of whispers. No one spoke openly about the truth. The priests had built the walls, but they had also built a prison of the mind, Fear ruled them all. Fear of the demon, fear of the goddess, and fear of the unknown. Joran knew the day would come when he could no longer ignore the gnawing inside him. That day had arrived. He reached the outskirts of the city and knelt by a small spring, the faintest trickle of water bubbling from the cracked ground. He closed his eyes, taking in a deep breath. The desert was quiet out here, its eternal hum vibrating against his bones. It felt safer, less suffocating. But his thoughts wouldn't leave him. The ritual, the heart, the way the priests continued their charade. It wasn't about protection, it was about control. They used the fear of the people to keep themselves on top, feeding the darkness while claiming to hold the light. Joran opened his eyes, staring at his reflection in the water. He could barely recognize the man who stared back at him anymore. His once solid faith had shattered, piece by piece, until all that was left was a man caught between belief and truth. And the truth was something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. But he couldn't turn back now. Not after everything he had seen, everything he had learned. The delusion creeps. In the next day, the city seemed quieter than usual, the air heavy with an unspoken tension. It was the day after the ritual, and Joran had heard the murmurs among the people. It was subtle at first, just the quiet gossip, the sideways glances between neighbors, the slight hesitation in voices when the priests' names were mentioned. But Joran could feel it now. The air had shifted. The hunger, the doubt, had settled deep within him, and it was beginning to twist into something else, something darker. There was no going back. He was already lost in the lies. Joran walked through the streets, noticing the little details he had once overlooked. The way the temple doors were always guarded. How the streets near the temple were more prosperous than those in the rest of the city. How the priests always appeared in public at the exact time of the monthly ritual, never once faltering in their well-rehearsed performances. He watched the people, their faces painted with devotion, their eyes empty of anything but blind faith. It sickened him. The priests were not gods. They were just men, ordinary men, pretending to be something they were not, and their goddess was nothing more than a myth to keep the masses in line. As Joran made his way home, his mind continued to race. He didn't have the answers yet, but he knew this. The people of Zatan'nataz were being lied to, and he would uncover the truth, no matter what the cost. On the last step into the abyss. That night, Joran couldn't sleep. He lay wide awake, staring at the ceiling, his mind spinning in endless circles. Every shadow seemed to whisper his name, every creak of the building an omen of what was to come. He had never been a man of faith, but he had never questioned it either. But now he couldn't help himself. The walls of Zatan'nataz were closing in, the lies suffocating him, and the hunger, the need for answers was unbearable. The demon's heart, the goddess, the priests. All of it was tied together in a knot of deceit, but the truth was elusive, just beyond his grasp. As Joran lay in his bed, the shadows in the room seemed to grow longer, stretching toward him. And for the first time in his life, Joran felt the cold hand of something far darker than fear. It was the abyss, the Zatan'nataz end of Chapter 1. This expanded Chapter 1 builds upon the growing paranoia and unease within Joran, while starting to unravel the truth behind the city's rituals and corruption. The haunting tone reflects his growing suspicion and internal conflict, setting the stage for his eventual rebellion against the established order in the chapters to come. Chapter 2. The Hidden Truth. The sun set low over Zatan'nataz, casting long shadows that stretched out like twisted fingers across the streets, embracing the city in an unsettling coldness. The city had always been a place of belief, a sanctuary in the desert, where people could turn to their faith for answers. But today, something felt different. The weight of suspicion hung heavy in the air, stifling the usual vibrancy of the market, muting the once familiar hum of the streets. Joran could feel it more than see it. The shift, the city, its people, the very ground beneath him. Everything felt somehow out of place, as though reality itself had been warped. The familiar places now seemed foreign, the comforting routine of the day suddenly sinister. He had always been an outsider, never truly invested in the daily rituals. never feeling the reverence that the people of Zatan'nataz did for the goddess and the priests who supposedly protected them. Yet he had always accepted the rituals, never questioning the words of the high priests, never challenging the notion of the goddess who supposedly kept the city safe from the demon below. But now, doubt gnawed at him. The more he thought about the truth he had uncovered in the scroll, the more unsettling everything became. The more he questioned, the deeper the lies seemed to stretch. The peaceful city of Zatan'nataz, which had always seemed like a place of unwavering faith, had become a fortress of fear, and Joran was trapped inside it. The people, they seemed so much more aware of the looming presence of the priests than they had ever been. Joran had spent his life ignoring their strange behaviors, their practices, but now, even their smiles felt false. It was as if they all wore masks, pretending to be content with their lives while hiding something darker just beneath the surface. And the delusion grows. Joran walked through the bustling streets, his steps slow and heavy. His heart beat in his chest, a steady rhythm, but it felt wrong, like something was offbeat, as if his very pulse had shifted with his understanding of the world. The people around him carried on with their daily routines, oblivious to the growing unease that gnawed at him. The marketplace vendors hawked their goods, their voices rising in the familiar chant of a daily ritual. Yet Joran could hear only the hollow echo of those words, their meaning lost to him. His mind buzzed with the images from the scroll, the goddess, the demon, the heart. The false security they had all lived under for generations. It was all based on a lie. The priests had kept them in the dark, manipulating the fear of the people to maintain their power, to feed the goddess's false existence. But why? Joran thought, his mind struggling to piece the fragments of the truth together. What was the real purpose behind it all? He knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't unsee what he had read. He couldn't ignore the gnawing truth that had begun to consume him, a relentless hunger for answers that twisted his thoughts into darker spirals. Every street corner, every face, seemed to mock him now. The people moved like puppets, following the motions of life without ever questioning the strings that controlled them. And the priests, those who stood at the top, cloaked in wealth and power, seemed more and more like tyrants, rulers in a kingdom of lies. The scroll had shown him a different world, a world where the goddess wasn't a savior, but a force of malevolent power, a world where the demon was never truly defeated, but rather kept dormant, feeding the dark energy that powered the priest's rule. The high priests had been using the demon's heart, not to defeat it, but to maintain control over the city, to keep the people enslaved in the false hope that their goddess would protect them. Joran shook his head, trying to shake the feeling of dread that had settled deep in his chest. He had always trusted the priests, trusted the ritual, but now that trust felt like a blade buried deep in his ribs, twisting with every breath. The unseen hand. Joran's footsteps led him to the familiar temple, the heart of the city. It loomed above him, its spires cutting into the sky like jagged teeth. The priests were inside, performing their ritual as they did every month. The people gathered around, eyes cast downward in reverence, offering their prayers. But Joran no longer saw it as a place of worship. It was a place of power, a place of control. He lingered in the shadow of the temple, watching the crowds, trying to make sense of the thoughts that churned in his mind. The people moved in sync, like clockwork, each one acting in unison, each one so deeply devoted to the cause that they had lost themselves in it. They didn't question. They didn't ask. They just followed. But in the silence between the prayers, Joran heard it. A whisper, faint but undeniable. It was in the wind, carried by the faintest breeze, just at the edge of his hearing. You know the truth now, Joran. You know what they've done. Joran froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The voice. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. He spun around, expecting to see someone standing behind him, but there was nothing. Only the empty streets. His breath came in short bursts as he tried to steady himself. His mind was playing tricks on him. The paranoia. The dread. It was all spiraling out of control. I must be losing my mind, he thought, trying to shake the unease that had taken root in his thoughts. I need to focus. I need to stay calm. But the voices didn't stop. They kept whispering to him, louder now. The priests control everything. The goddess is a lie, and they have been feeding you lies, Joran, for your entire life. The walls around him seemed to close in, and he staggered backward, gasping for air. The people passing by paid no attention to his distress, their eyes glazed over with devotion, their bodies moving as if they were controlled by some unseen hand. Joran's hands trembled as he clutched his head, trying to block out the whispers, but they only grew louder. The very ground beneath him seemed to tremble, as if the city itself was alive, breathing, feeding on his fear. His eyes darted around, seeking an escape, but the streets were too narrow, the shadows too deep. He turned away from the temple, his breath ragged in his chest. He had to get away. He had to get somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't suffocating him with the weight of the truth. But no matter where he went, the whispers followed. They'll find out what you know, Joran. They won't let you leave. They never do. Joran ran through the streets, his mind spinning, his legs moving faster than his thoughts could keep up. His heart was a drum in his chest, a beat that seemed to drive him deeper into madness. He could see the priests now, standing tall above the crowd, their cold eyes watching him with knowing looks. They were the puppet masters, and he was just a pawn in their game. The final revelation. Finally, Joran found himself at the outskirts of the city, near the edge of the desert. The wind howled through the barren landscape, but it was quiet here. There was no crowd, no priests, no whispers. Just the vast, empty desert stretching out before him. Joran collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching the sand beneath him. He gasped for air, trying to steady himself, but the truth was too heavy. The city is built on lies. The goddess is a lie. And the priests have been feeding off our fear, feeding off our belief for centuries. He had seen it. The truth was right there in the scroll, right there in the very walls of the temple. The heart was not for protection. It was a tool of power, keeping the city enslaved to a false faith. Joran closed his eyes, the weight of his discovery sinking deep into his bones. There was no going back. He had seen the truth, and now it was his responsibility to expose it. But as he stood, wiping the sweat from his brow, a single thought echoed in his mind, one that chilled him to his core. And what will they do to you when they find out? For Zatan'nataz, end of chapter 2. As this expanded version of chapter 2 takes Joran deeper into his descent into paranoia and fear as he begins to question everything he once believed. The haunted, delusional atmosphere heightens, with visions and whispers following him, feeding into his internal conflict. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger, emphasizing his spiraling mental state as he discovers the truth. Chapter 3. The plot unfolds. The streets of Zatan'nataz had never felt so suffocating. The city, which had always seemed alive with movement, now felt like a place frozen in time, a place where the whispers of the past had settled into the very walls, and the air carried with it a sense of foreboding that clung to Joran's skin like dust. Every step he took felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of his discovery, the terrible truth about the goddess, the demon's heart, and the priests, was pressing down on him, warping the very fabric of reality. It was late afternoon, the sun hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows across the city. The people moved in their usual routines, but today their movements seemed more like the slow, deliberate gestures of actors playing a part in some long-forgotten play. Their eyes were fixed on the ground, their voices muffled by the oppressive silence that had settled over the streets. They didn't see him. They never saw him. They were blind to the truth that had begun to tear at Joran's mind, and it made him feel alone. Not just alone in the way a man might feel when isolated from others, but as though he were a ghost among the living. As Joran walked, he found himself glancing over his shoulder every few steps. Was he being watched? Was someone following him? The thought had crept into his mind earlier, and now it gnawed at him, refusing to let him focus. It wasn't just the priests or the high priest's spies. No, it was something deeper, something in the air, something unnatural. The city felt like a living thing, breathing with an ancient, malignant intent. And every time Joran passed a shadowed alley or a darkened doorway, he could feel it watching him. He quickened his pace, the uneven cobblestones beneath his feet seeming to mock his every movement, and yet there was nowhere to hide. No escape. The city was alive with secrets, and it would take everything from him before he could uncover the truth. The labyrinth of truth. Joran had never thought much of the old library. It had always seemed like a place of dust and shadows, a place where forgotten stories and knowledge gathered cobwebs. Yet today, it called to him. The faintest pull, a whisper in the back of his mind that he couldn't ignore. He had heard stories about the priest's secret collection of scrolls and books, the ones hidden deep within the labyrinthine halls of the library. Stories of texts that spoke of the goddess, the demon, and the ancient rituals that had been kept hidden from the public. As he stood before the imposing door of the library, his hand trembling on the cold brass handle, a familiar sense of unease washed over him. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, and the smell of musty parchment and aged wood hit him immediately. It was a smell that spoke of forgotten truths and long-buried secrets. The air was thick, stagnant, almost as if the building itself had been holding its breath for centuries. Inside, the library was dark, the only light coming from a few flickering candles that cast long dancing shadows on the walls. The shelves stretched high, crammed with books and scrolls, each one a testament to a time long past. It was a place where knowledge was hoarded, hidden away from the prying eyes of the people. Joran's heart pounded in his chest as he moved deeper into the library, his fingers trailing over the spines of ancient texts. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faintest rustling of paper as he turned each page, desperately searching for something, anything, that would confirm his suspicions. He knew the scroll he had found earlier in the day held the key, but it was incomplete, fragmented. There were pieces missing. He had to find them. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, waiting. Every now and then, he would hear the faintest sound, a footstep echoing down one of the aisles, a door creaking open and shut. Each sound seemed to come from a place just out of his reach, just outside the corner of his vision. It was as if the library was alive, and it was aware of his presence. Joran's breath grew shallow as he approached the back of the library, where the bookshelves seemed darker, more oppressive. He knew the priests kept their most sacred texts here, hidden away in the deepest corners. His fingers brushed the edge of an old weathered tome, and as he opened it, a cold shiver ran down his spine. The text was written in a language he didn't recognize, symbols and glyphs that seemed to twist and writhe on the page, almost alive in their own right. The words seemed to move in front of his eyes, swirling together into a form he could barely comprehend. They spoke of the goddess, but not as a savior. No, she was a prisoner, a creature of darkness who had been bound by the priests to maintain their power. She had never been their protector. She had never protected the city from the demon beneath. The priests, in their greed and their thirst for control, had kept the truth hidden from everyone, and the truth was far worse than Joran had ever imagined. The fear begins. Joran's eyes blurred as he read the ancient text, the words sinking into his mind like poison, twisting and warping his understanding of everything he had known. The goddess was not a divine being. She was a force, a malevolent presence that fed on fear, on devotion. She had been imprisoned beneath the earth for centuries, her power held in check by the ritual sacrifices. The priests had fed her, kept her alive, so that she could give them the power to rule over the city. But it wasn't just the goddess they had controlled. It was the demon as well. The demon that the priests claimed to defeat every month. It wasn't destroyed. It had never been destroyed. It had been kept alive by the priests, bound to the city's very foundation, feeding off the sacrifices they offered. The heart of the demon was never given to the goddess. It was kept, sealed away in the depths of the pit of Zatan'nataz, to maintain the balance of power. Joran's mind reeled. The city, the people, the rituals, the beliefs, had all been built on lies. Everything had been a facade, a carefully constructed lie designed to keep the people in fear, in control. The priests were not the servants of the goddess. They were her jailers, her torturers, feeding off the suffering of the people to maintain their dominance. Joran's breath came faster now, and the library around him seemed to close in, the shelves pressing together like the walls of a tomb. He staggered back, the weight of the revelation crashing down on him. His heart thudded in his chest, louder than the silence that surrounded him. They've been feeding us lies, he thought, his mind spinning in a frenzy. The goddess, the demon, the priests, they're all part of the same twisted game. He stumbled backwards, his vision swimming, the shadows in the corners of the room stretching toward him like fingers, pulling him in. The oppressive weight of the knowledge he had uncovered pressed against him, suffocating him. His breath came in gasps, and he could feel his legs weakening beneath him. The air was thick with dread, with a presence that seemed to move just out of sight. He turned and fled from the library, his mind racing, his heart pounding. As he burst out into the streets, the world around him seemed to distort. The buildings, the people, they were all wrong. He could see their faces, but their eyes were vacant, hollow, as though they were nothing more than puppets, moving through the motions of life without ever truly living. And then, as he passed by the temple, the whispers came again, louder, more insistent. You can't escape the truth, Joran. It's in you now. It's part of you. He stumbled, his knees buckling beneath him. The voices were all around him now, swirling, suffocating. The city had never been real. The goddess had never been real. The priests were not gods. They were demons in their own right, and the truth was worse than anything Joran had imagined. The world was crumbling around him, and there was nowhere to hide. End of chapter 3. In this expanded chapter 3, we see Joran's descent into madness and the deepening horror as he uncovers the truth about the priests, the goddess, and the demon. His paranoia grows, and the walls of reality begin to close in on him. The atmosphere is tense, claustrophobic, and filled with a sense of impending doom. Joran is trapped, caught between the truth and the terrifying implications it holds. This chapter sets the stage for the unraveling of everything Joran has known, and the psychological horror only grows as the story progresses. Chapter 4. Secrets in the Shadows. The streets of Zatan'nataz seemed to close in on Joran as he stumbled through the marketplace, his heart pounding, his mind a whirl of confusion and dread. The city, once a place of sanctuary, now felt like a prison. The people, those same faces he had passed 1,000 times, had become strangers to him. They moved as if trapped in some kind of trance, oblivious to the dark reality that was slowly unraveling around them. The city's pulse was no longer steady. It was erratic, a heartbeat speeding up and slowing down with the rhythm of Joran's panic. The sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the city in deepening shadows. The familiar street lamps flickered, casting eerie glows on the cobblestones, stretching the darkness into twisted shapes. It felt like the city itself was watching him, closing in on him, suffocating him with its secrets. The whispers had followed him from the library, growing louder and more insistent as the night descended. You know the truth now, Joran. You can't escape it. His breath came in short, shallow gasps. The world around him seemed distorted, shifting like a mirage. He didn't know who to trust anymore. His thoughts felt tangled, every step he took pulling him deeper into the abyss. The truth had changed everything, and the worst part was that he had no idea what to do with it. Joran stumbled into an alley, trying to collect his thoughts, trying to focus. But the fear, no, the paranoia, it was consuming him. Every flicker of movement, every whisper of the wind made him jump. It was as if the entire city were conspiring against him, watching him unravel, waiting for him to make a mistake. Why did I ever seek the truth, he thought, the question turning over in his mind like a curse. Why didn't I just stay ignorant? But it was too late for that. The veil had been lifted. The lies had been shattered. Now he was left with nothing but the cold, hard truth. The priests knew. They knew all along. They've been lying to us, to everyone, and they will never let me expose them. Joran shuddered at the thought. What could he possibly do against them? They were everywhere. They controlled the city, the people, the very foundation of their lives. And now that Joran knew the truth, they would stop at nothing to silence him. He had to find the others, the people who had seen what he had seen, the ones who could help him fight back. But even as he thought about it, doubt crept in. Who could he trust? How did he know they hadn't already been turned, already been corrupted by the priests? The paranoia gripped him again. tightening its hold, and he started to wonder if the city was already lost. The encounter. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing down the alley. Joran froze, his blood running cold. Someone was following him. The footsteps grew louder, quicker, as if the person was closing in on him. Joran's hand instinctively went to the hilt of his knife, his fingers tightening around the cool steel. He tried to control his breath, to steady himself. But the fear, the overwhelming fear, made it impossible to think clearly. The city was a labyrinth of shadows, and there was nowhere to hide. A figure emerged from the shadows ahead, tall and cloaked in dark robes. Joran's heart skipped a beat. He didn't recognize the figure, but there was something about them, something unsettlingly familiar. The cloak was drawn tightly around them, their face obscured by the hood. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. The figure stepped closer, and Joran's hand went to the knife at his side, ready to strike if necessary. But before he could move, the figure spoke. "You've been looking for answers." The voice was low, raspy, but it carried a weight of authority that made Joran's stomach churn. "And now you've found them." Joran's throat went dry. The voice. He knew that voice. It was the same voice he had heard before, in the library, in his dreams. It was the voice of the old priest. "Who are you?" Joran's voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "What do you want from me?" The figure's head tilted slightly, as if considering the question, before stepping closer still. "You're afraid?" the old priest said, his tone almost sympathetic. "Afraid of what you've uncovered, of what the truth means. But there's no going back now. You can't unlearn what you've seen." Joran took a step back, his breath coming faster now. The old priest's words seemed to twist in his mind, echoing over and over again. The truth. There was no going back. But what did that mean for him? What was he supposed to do now? "I need to stop them," Joran said, his voice trembling. "I have to stop them, the priests, the goddess, the demon's heart, everything. It's all a lie. It's all a trap." The old priest remained silent for a moment, watching Joran with an unreadable expression. "You're right," he finally said. "It's all a lie, but you can't stop it alone. No one can." Joran's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean? Who else knows?" The old priest's eyes glittered from beneath his hood. "There are others, but not all of them will welcome you, Joran. Some are loyal to the priests, some are loyal to the goddess. It's not just the priest you have to fight, it's the city itself." Joran's stomach tightened at the words. The city itself. The thought was almost too much to bear. The entire city. It seemed impossible. "I'm not afraid," Joran said, though his voice wavered. "I've already seen what they've done. I've seen the truth. And now I have to stop them. But I can't do it alone." The old priest studied him carefully, his gaze penetrating, as though searching for something hidden beneath Joran's words. "You're right," the priest said at last. "You can't do this alone, but you don't have to. There are others who want the same thing. You'll need to find them, trust them. But be careful, Joran. Trust is a fragile thing in this city, and betrayal. Betrayal is always just one step away." Joran's mind reeled with the implications of what the old priest was saying. He had to find others. But who could he trust? Was he already too far gone, too deep into the web of lies and deceit? He didn't know, but the clock was ticking. Every second spent doubting was another second the priests could use to silence him. He had to act. The old priest stepped back into the shadows, his form blending with the night. "Meet me tomorrow night," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I'll show you the way. But be careful. The priests know more than you think. And they're already watching." With that, the figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving Joran alone in the alley, his heart pounding in his chest. The weight of the decision lay heavy on him. The truth was no longer just a dangerous secret. It was a weapon, and he was about to wield it. The city stirs. Joran didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. His mind was consumed by the conversation with the old priest. The city felt different now, darker, heavier, like a storm was building on the horizon, and no one could see it coming. As dawn broke, casting a pale light over Zatan'nataz, Joran found himself walking the streets with a sense of urgency. He needed to prepare, needed to find the others before it was too late. He couldn't afford to wait any longer. The priests were too powerful. They had built this city on lies, and now it was time to tear it down. But even as he walked, the fear gnawed at him, the doubt, the questions. Who could he trust? Who would stand with him when the time came? And who would betray him? As the sun rose higher in the sky, Joran felt the weight of the city pressing down on him. He had chosen his path, but the path was fraught with danger. The priests would not let him get away with what he knew, and soon he would learn just how far they would go to keep their secrets safe. End of chapter 4. This chapter 4 continues Joran's descent into madness and fear, expanding the narrative with a greater sense of tension, paranoia, and horror. The confrontation with the old priest introduces a critical turning point in Joran's journey, and the atmosphere of dread becomes even more intense as he faces the reality of the fight ahead. The city itself begins to feel like a living entity, one that is aware of Joran's intentions and will do everything in its power. Chapter 5. The city beneath the surface. The night fell quickly, and with it the shadows in Zatan'nataz seemed to deepen. The city, a place of deceiving serenity by day, morphed into something far darker under the cover of night. The streets were quieter now, the usual bustle of merchants and citizens replaced by an unsettling silence. Joran had grown accustomed to the way the city felt, but tonight it felt different. Tonight, the streets seemed alive, alive with secrets, with whispers that clung to the air like an unspoken curse. As he made his way to the designated meeting place, the fear gnawed at him. The promise of finding allies, of gathering those who saw the truth as he did, should have given him hope. But all he felt was dread. The truth had already come for him, clawing at his mind like a hungry beast. Every step he took felt heavier, as if the ground beneath him was pulling him down. It was as though the city itself had noticed him, had sensed the weight of the knowledge he carried, and it was trying to swallow him whole. Joran reached the alley where the old priest had said to meet. The same alley he had fled into only hours before, when the weight of the truth had nearly crushed him. He hesitated for a moment, glancing around, but the street was empty, the shadows swallowing everything in their grasp. Where are they? Joran thought. Did they betray me? The question plagued him, and the fear it bred festered in the pit of his stomach. Every rustle in the wind felt like a warning. The city was watching him. He was certain of it. He could feel the eyes on him, hidden in every shadow, every window. It was no longer just the priests he feared. It was the city itself. The walls seemed to close in on him, suffocating him with the weight of the lies that had kept the people enslaved for so long. He had to keep moving. He couldn't let himself be caught. The truth was dangerous. He was dangerous now. The old priest had warned him, but the city had already started to change him, shifting his perception, distorting everything he saw. He didn't know who to trust anymore. Even the alley itself felt wrong now, as if the bricks beneath his feet were shifting, pressing closer with every breath. The meeting. It was then that he saw a figure step from the shadows. A man, cloaked in dark robes, with a hood that hid his face. The figure moved toward Joran, silent, fluid in his movements, as if he were part of the darkness itself. Joran's heart skipped a beat, his hand instinctively reaching for his knife, but the figure's voice halted him. You came. The voice was deep, calm, and somehow too calm. The words were familiar, but there was an edge to them, as though they had been spoken 1,000 times before, rehearsed in the silence of the shadows. Joran swallowed hard, his voice trembling. Who are you? The figure stepped closer, revealing a face half-shadowed by the hood. I am one who seeks the truth just as you do. And you, Joran, you are the last one who can break the chains of this city. Joran took a step back, his heart racing. What do you want from me? The figure's gaze was unsettling, piercing, as though he could see straight through Joran's mind. What you have uncovered is the beginning, but it is not enough to change anything. You will need more. You will need those who can help you expose the priests, those who are waiting to tear down the lies. Joran hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. I don't know if I can trust anyone. Not after what I've seen. The priests, the goddess, the demon's heart. It's all a lie. A trap. The figure smiled, a thin, knowing smile. You are right. It is a lie, but we are not bound by that lie. There are others like you, Joran. Others who know the truth. But you will have to find them. They are hiding in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the truth finally breaks free. Joran's mind reeled. Where are they? How do I find them? You'll know them when you see them. They will find you, the figure replied cryptically. But there is one thing you must understand, Joran. The truth you seek will not come easily. There are forces at work far older than the priests, and far more dangerous. They will not let you expose the truth without a fight. Joran's blood ran cold. What are you saying? The figure's voice dropped to a whisper. You are not the only one searching for the truth. The goddess, the demon, everything you've learned. They are all part of a much larger game. And the players are watching. They know you're close, Joran. And when they come, they will come for you first. Joran's legs felt weak, the weight of the figure's words pressing down on him. Who are they? What are they? The figure paused, then looked directly into Joran's eyes. They are the Watchers. They are the ones who have kept the truth buried, the ones who have controlled this city for centuries. The priests are only pawns in their game. The real power lies beneath Zatan'nataz, beneath the city you thought you knew. The city's heart. The words hung in the air, suffocating Joran. He tried to make sense of them, but the more he thought about it, the more his mind seemed to spiral. The city had always felt off, but now, with the figure's words in his ears, it felt more alive than ever. Alive in a way that was unnatural, sickening. It was as though something was stirring beneath the surface, something old and hungry, something that had been waiting for him. You will find the others, the figure said, his voice growing softer, as if retreating back into the shadows. But be careful, Joran. You cannot trust anyone, not even yourself. The truth is a dangerous thing. It will consume you if you let it. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness, leaving only the sound of Joran's ragged breath in the still night air. Joran stood alone in the alley, his heart pounding, the words of the figure echoing in his mind. The Watchers, the truth, the city, it all seemed too much to grasp, but the fear was real, the danger was real, and the city was not what it seemed. He had known that instinctively deep down, but now it was undeniable. Joran turned and fled the alley, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestones. He had to find the others. He had to uncover the truth. But he couldn't shake the feeling that the city was already closing in on him. That every step he took brought him closer to something terrible. He was no longer sure who was watching him. The city, the priests, the goddess herself. Or was it something worse, something far older, waiting for its time to strike? Joran's mind raced with the weight of what had been revealed to him. But one thing was clear. He could no longer hide. He could no longer run from the truth. He had to confront it, even if it meant facing the dark heart of Zatan'nataz itself. The Watchers move. As Joran walked away, the shadows of the city seemed to lengthen, stretching toward him, closing in like a suffocating web. He glanced over his shoulder, just for a moment, and thought he saw a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. But when he turned fully, there was nothing there. Was he being followed? The paranoia was creeping back, whispering in his ear that the city was not just a place, but a living entity, a beast that fed on fear and secrets. He quickened his pace, feeling the presence of the Watchers in every shadow, in every corner of his vision. Joran didn't know who to trust anymore. But one thing was certain. The game was much bigger than he had ever realized. The truth, the demon, the goddess, they were all part of a scheme far older than Zatan'nataz. And the people, his people, had been blind to it for generations. The city was waking up, and it was waiting for him. End of Chapter 5. This Chapter 5 builds on Joran's growing sense of paranoia and unease, as the revelations about the truth of the city and its hidden rulers deepen. His interaction with the mysterious figure adds layers of complexity to the conspiracy, and the chapter ends with Joran facing the horrifying reality that the city itself is part of the forces working against him. The tension between Joran's desire for truth and the terror of what he has learned intensifies, setting the stage for the next chapter. Chapter 6. The City's Heart. The shadows clung to Joran like a second skin as he made his way through the city, his footsteps muted on the cobblestone streets. The night had settled into a cold, biting silence. The faint glow of the moon barely pierced the thick layer of dark clouds that seemed to hang, suspended over Zatan'nataz like a looming spectre. The city, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a maze, a labyrinth of secrets that threatened to consume him. Everywhere he looked, the walls seemed to whisper, as though the very stones of Zatan'nataz were alive, waiting for him to make a misstep. Joran's mind raced. The conversation with the old priest still echoed in his head, and the words, the watchers, the truth, the heart of the city, seemed to carve themselves into his skull, refusing to let him forget. But with every question that formed in his mind, another question appeared in its place. A labyrinth within a labyrinth, twisting and shifting in ways that made it impossible to find a way out. The watchers, the very idea unsettled him. Were they the priests? Or something more ancient, something more powerful, something that had been hiding beneath the surface for centuries? The old priest had spoken in riddles, offered no real answers, only cryptic warnings. And now Joran was left to piece together the fragments, to make sense of the things he couldn't understand. But what if there was nothing to understand? What if everything he had uncovered so far was a trap, a ploy to drive him mad? Joran shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts, but the silence of the city pressed in on him, suffocating him, like a hand around his throat. Every alleyway he passed seemed darker, every corner more oppressive. The people had gone inside, retreating to the safety of their homes, leaving the streets eerily empty. Joran couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for him, something hidden just beyond his reach. The heart of the city. Joran had a destination in mind, the pit of Zatan'nataz, the ancient, mysterious place where the demon's heart was kept. It was a place no one dared enter, a place surrounded by myth and fear. According to the priests, it was a sacred ground, a place where the heart of the demon was sealed away, where the goddess's power could be maintained. But Joran had learned the truth. There was no goddess to protect them, no savior waiting to rise from the depths. The heart of the demon had never been destroyed. It had only been contained, kept alive by the priests, feeding off the power of fear, feeding off the people's belief. The pit of Zatan'nataz was at the heart of Zatan'nataz, deep beneath the city, hidden from the eyes of the people. But Joran knew it wasn't just a physical location. It was a symbol of the corruption that had spread through every corner of the city. The very heart of the city was a lie. The air grew heavier as he approached the hidden entrance. An old, forgotten door wedged between two ancient buildings, tucked away in a narrow alley. It was easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. The stone was covered in moss, its surface weathered by time, but Joran could still make out the faint carvings on its surface. Symbols, markings that he had seen before in the scrolls, in the ancient texts the priests had tried to hide. The carvings seemed to twist, to shift before his eyes, and for a moment, he wondered if he was losing his mind. But he couldn't stop now. He had to know the truth. Joran took a deep breath and pushed open the door, his heart racing. The air that greeted him was cool, damp, and musty. The darkness that enveloped the room seemed to seep into his bones, and for a moment, he hesitated, wondering if he should turn back. But the question in his mind was louder than the doubt. What lay ahead? And if he didn't face it now, would he ever be able to? The corridor before him stretched deep into the earth, the walls rough and uneven, as though it had been carved out hastily, a passage built in secrecy. The silence was oppressive. It felt as though the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for him to move, to take the next step. He walked down the narrow passage, the cold stone underfoot clicking softly with each step. The air grew colder, the walls seeming to close in on him as he descended further. His breath came in ragged bursts, and his hands trembled as he gripped the walls for support. But there was no turning back. The deeper he went, the more the weight of the truth pressed down on him. And with every step, Joran could feel his grip on reality slipping further. Was he really here? Was this real, or was it just another delusion? Another trick his mind was playing on him. The passage narrowed further. The air thick with the scent of decay and something far older. Something foul. Joran's stomach turned, but he forced himself to keep moving, to push forward. The whispers had become louder now, rising in his ears like a tide. He could hear them, faint at first, but unmistakable now. The city will consume you. You are not meant to know. The voice was soft, but it cut through him like ice. Joran stopped, his heart racing in his chest. He spun around, but there was no one there, no one to be seen. The passage was empty. The shadows stretched long behind him, dark shapes moving with the flickering light from his torch. He was not alone. Wukbaths, the voice of the city. Joran continued forward, his hand pressed tightly against the wall, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The shadows seemed to cling to him, to follow him, and he could feel them pressing in on him as if the very walls of the passage were alive, watching him. He turned a corner and stopped dead in his tracks. Before him was a massive chamber, its walls lined with ancient stone. The ceiling rose high above him, lost in the darkness, and the air in the room was thick with the scent of age, of something far older than Zatan'nataz itself. At the center of the chamber lay an altar, its surface slick with an unnatural gleam, and there it was, the heart. It was enormous, its surface covered in strange pulsing veins, dark and slick, as though it were alive. Joran could feel it in his chest. Feel the pulse, feel the power that radiated from it. It was the source of everything. The power of the priests, the power of the city. It was the demon's heart, and it had been kept here for centuries, hidden beneath the city, feeding off the people's fear and devotion. Joran's hand went to his knife, but it felt useless, inadequate against the force before him. He had come here to destroy it, to stop the cycle. But as he stood there, staring at the heart, he realized something. This was no mere heart. It was a force, a presence, and it was awake. The Watcher's Game. Suddenly, Joran heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, soft and measured, echoing from the shadows. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He spun around, but there was no one there. The chamber was empty. The silence that followed felt like a weight pressing on his chest. And then, he heard the voice again, louder this time, as if it were speaking directly into his ear. The Watchers have seen you. You can't escape. You are already part of the game. The words chilled him to his core. He looked around, his hand gripping his knife tightly, but the chamber remained still. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows shifting, like something was watching him, waiting. Joran backed away from the altar, his heart hammering in his chest. He had come to destroy the heart, but now he realized something far worse. He wasn't the one in control. He wasn't the one hunting the truth. The truth had been waiting for him. The city had been waiting for him. Chapter 7. The Demon's Embrace. The city was alive. That much was certain. Joran could feel it in his bones, a steady pulse that echoed through the cobblestones beneath his feet. Through the air he breathed, through the very walls of the city that seemed to hum with an ancient, malevolent energy. The longer he stayed within the city's confines, the harder it became to distinguish between reality and nightmare. The boundaries between the two were becoming ever more blurred, each step taking him deeper into a labyrinth of madness he couldn't escape. It had been 2 days since he had ventured into the pit of Zakas, where the heart of the demon lay beneath the city, pulsing with a dark, irresistible power. Since then, the air had grown thicker, heavier, charged with a kind of electric dread. The whispers had returned louder than ever, echoing in his mind, drowning out the world around him. They were everywhere now. In every alley, in every shadow, in every glance from the people of the city who passed by him with their eyes averted, their faces too still. They weren't just avoiding him. They were avoiding the truth he now carried. He was becoming something else, something other. The city was changing him, slowly but surely, as though it were infecting him with its sickness. Every creak of a floorboard in his home, Every flicker of the streetlights in the distance, every faint echo of footfalls behind him set his nerves on edge. He had stopped sleeping. The nightmares were too real, too vivid. The city was watching him. The shadows, the people, the very streets, they were all waiting for something. And it was as if Joran had become the center of it all. The city had noticed him, noticed that he had uncovered its truth, and now it was coming for him. The fear had taken root, deep in his chest, gnawing at him like a slow, persistent fever. The more he looked into the eyes of the people around him, the more he saw it, the emptiness. They were nothing more than puppets. Puppets who danced to the tune of the priests, to the will of the dark power that held them all in thrall. Joran had seen the truth, the heart of the demon, the twisted force that had been kept alive for centuries, and now it had its claws in him, pulling him deeper into the abyss. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst part was the city itself, the way it seemed to bleed into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts, distorting his sense of self. He wasn't sure where he ended and where the city began anymore. Had he been this way all along? Was he always going to be part of this dark, twisted thing? The truth of the heart, the reality of the goddess and the demon, they were not just facts to be uncovered. They were alive, pulsing through every stone in Zatan'nataz, pumping through his veins with every breath he took. The Watcher's eyes. Joran had to move. He couldn't stay here. But where could he go? He could feel it, the presence, the Watchers. They were always there, watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. The city had become a prison, each shadow a potential threat, each turn a dead end. The more he moved through the streets, the more the city seemed to close in on him. The people were there, but not really. They were a part of the machine now, their eyes empty, their movements mechanical. They didn't see him, not really. They couldn't. They were trapped in the same web of lies he had once believed in. But they weren't the only ones watching. Joran could feel their eyes, the Watchers. He could feel them in the air, in the cracks of the walls, in the very stones beneath his feet. And the worst part was, he couldn't tell if they were real or just figments of his growing paranoia. Had the city itself become sentient, aware of him, aware of the knowledge he carried? Or was it just his mind, unraveling at the seams? Joran had seen what was hidden beneath the city. He had walked through the pit of Zakas, seen the demon's heart with his own eyes. The heart that pulsed with a sickening rhythm, as if it were waiting for something, as if it were waiting for him. It was the heart of the city, and now it had become a part of him. He could feel its presence, a constant thrum in the back of his mind. The more he thought about it, the more he felt its pull. It wasn't just the heart anymore. It was the city itself. It was as if everything in Zatan'nataz was connected to it, woven together in a web of darkness that stretched back centuries. Joran tried to shake it off, but the feeling only intensified. He was being hunted, not by the priests, not by the demon, but by something far older, far more insidious. The Watchers. They had seen him. They knew what he had uncovered, and now they were closing in. The encounter. He was halfway through the market when it happened. The crowd seemed to part for a moment, as though the air itself had thickened, and Joran found himself face to face with a figure. She was standing in the shadows of a nearby archway, her face obscured by a hood, her features hidden in the darkness. Joran's heart skipped a beat. There was something familiar about her, but he couldn't place it. For a moment they stood there, staring at each other in silence. The street around them seemed to fade, the noise of the market drowning into a low, ominous hum. Joran felt a tightening in his chest. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. "Joran," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper, yet it carried through the air like 1,000 echoes. "I've been waiting for you." His pulse quickened. He took a step back, his eyes narrowing. "Who are you?" The woman tilted her head slightly, her eyes glinting from under the hood. "I know what you've found. I know what you've seen. And I know what you intend to do." Joran's mind raced. He couldn't place her, but there was something about the way she spoke, something ancient, something that sent a cold shiver down his spine. "Who are you?" he repeated, his voice shaking. She stepped forward, her movements graceful, fluid, like she was part of the very shadows. I am one of the Watchers, she said, her tone almost bored, as though the words were old and familiar to her. I've been watching you, Joran. Watching your descent. Watching as you struggle with the truth. The truth. The word echoed in Joran's mind like a drumbeat. The truth. That truth. The demon's heart. The goddess. The priests. The Watchers. You know what the heart means, don't you? The woman continued, her voice soft, coaxing, as though she were talking to a child. It is the pulse of the city. It is what keeps everything alive, keeps everything in its place. Without it, Zatan'nataz would fall, and so would you. Joran's chest tightened. What are you saying? She took another step forward, her presence enveloping him like a cloud. I'm saying that you are already too far gone. You've seen too much. You think you can fight it, but you can't. The heart is connected to you now. It's part of you. The realization hit him like a thunderclap. He felt it. The pull, the presence, the darkness that had taken root in his mind. The heart of the demon, the city, the Watchers, they were all intertwined, feeding off the same force. And Joran. Joran was now part of it. The woman smiled, a thin, almost pitying smile. You think you can stop it, but you're already inside. You were always meant to be. We've been waiting for you, Joran. We've been watching. The city's embrace. The woman turned and began to walk away, her figure swallowed by the darkness of the alley. But Joran couldn't move. He stood frozen, his mind swirling with the impossible truth. Was he a part of this now? Had he always been? The city, the heart, the Watchers, it was all connected. And Joran was now a thread in that web. For a moment, he thought he might collapse right there in the street. But instead, he stood tall, his fists clenched at his sides. No, he wouldn't be their pawn. He couldn't let them win. But deep down, he could feel the truth, could feel the power of the heart pulsing through him. And as the city around him continued to breathe, alive, hungry, aware, Joran realized with a cold, bitter clarity that there was no escape. End of Chapter 7. This expanded Chapter 7 delves deeper into Joran's paranoia, as the lines between reality and delusion continue to blur. The presence of the Watchers intensifies the feeling of being hunted, while the woman introduces a terrifying new layer to the conspiracy. The chapter builds on Joran's internal conflict and his growing understanding that he's more entangled in the city's dark heart than he could have ever imagined. The horror deepens, and the stakes grow higher as he realizes that escape may no longer be an option. Chapter 8. Beneath the veil, the night had become a thing of deep, unfathomable dread. The oppressive weight of the city pressed down on Joran like 1,000 invisible hands, suffocating him in the cold, suffocating silence that had engulfed Zatan'nataz. The market square, which was once a place of mundane life, was now an alien landscape. Its stone paths twisted, the shadows stretching longer than they should, as though they were feeding on the fears of those who still dared to walk them. Joran had barely slept since his encounter with the woman, the Watcher. Her words haunted him, replaying in his mind like a broken record. You were always meant to be a part of it. The idea that he too was a puppet in this grand dark play, both a part of and enslaved to the city's will, was unbearable. He had always thought of himself as a seeker of truth, a man brave enough to uncover the lies that bound Zatan'nataz. But now, with the crushing weight of the heart, the demon, the Watchers, and the goddess pulling him deeper into the abyss, he wasn't sure if he had ever truly been free. He had always known that the city had secrets, that the air itself seemed thick with something dark, something alive. But now the knowledge had become suffocating. The truth of the demon's heart and its connection to Zatan'nataz had irrevocably changed him. He was no longer just a man wandering the streets. He was part of something far darker, a cog in the machine that had been in motion for centuries. Every step he took in the city felt like a descent into madness. The walls whispered as he walked past, the echoes of ancient rituals and sacrifices reverberating through the air. The city was full of eyes, eyes that watched his every move, eyes that were hidden in the cracks of the stones, the walls, the people. No matter where he turned, it felt like something, or someone, was always just out of sight, waiting, watching. Joran had hoped to find some semblance of truth in his actions, a way to destroy the demon's heart, to end the cycle of corruption. But the deeper he dug, the more he began to fear that the truth was a nightmare that would never end. His discovery of the heart had only served to bind him tighter to the city. He was no longer just a man trying to fight for justice. He was the truth, or at least part of it. And now that the truth had found him, there was no turning back. The visit to the old temple. Joran's feet carried him towards the old temple at the heart of Zatan'nataz, the sacred place where the heart had been hidden for so long. It was the one place in the city that held all of the answers. Answers he feared. Answers that could shatter everything he thought he knew. The heart of the demon lay deep within, pulsing with an energy that seemed to hum in the air itself. Joran had seen it once, in the pit of Zakas, but what he hadn't understood then, what he hadn't felt, was the presence of it. The heart wasn't just a source of power. It was alive, feeding off fear, on devotion, on the very life force of the city. As he neared the entrance to the temple, Joran's heart began to race. The door loomed before him, ancient and heavy, its surface adorned with symbols he had learned to fear. These were not just markings of worship, but of a power far darker, a power that had held Zatan'nataz in its grip for centuries. This was no place of peace, it was a place of dominion. The air was thick with an unnatural chill as Joran pushed open the doors. The grand hall before him was silent, suffused with shadows. His breath echoed off the stone walls, and every step he took seemed to reverberate with the sound of his own pulse. The flickering light of his torch cast long shadows that danced along the walls, twisting and distorting into grotesque forms that seemed to leer at him. He entered the heart of the temple, where the ritual sacrifices had once been made, where the demon's heart had been sealed away for so many years. The altar stood before him, its dark surface reflecting the torchlight, its cold stone unmoving and unfeeling. But something in the air had changed. The very room itself seemed to be alive, watching him. "You should not be here." The voice came again, louder now, echoing in his mind, a hiss in the silence. He whirled around, the torch shaking in his hand, but there was no one there, no one to be seen. Only shadows, only the feeling of something else, something ancient, stirring in the corners of his vision. "They are watching you, Joran. They have always been watching. You cannot escape now." Joran's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure if the voice was real or just another hallucination, a product of his growing paranoia. His mind had been fraying at the edges ever since his encounter with the Watcher, the woman who had spoken those terrible words to him. But the terror, the overwhelming dread, felt real. He could feel it, pressing in on him, suffocating him. The air was so thick now with the scent of incense and something far worse, something sickening, that Joran had to choke back the bile rising in his throat. The oppressive weight of it was unbearable. The walls of the temple, the very foundation of Zatan'nataz, seemed to close in around him, as though the city itself were holding him captive, trapping him in its web. Suddenly, Joran felt a presence behind him, a coldness that crept up his spine. He turned slowly, his breath caught in his throat, and found himself face to face with a figure. A man, tall and cloaked, standing in the doorway. It was the high priest, the one who had once overseen the rituals, the man who had been a constant figure of authority in Zatan'nataz. His face was hidden beneath a hood, but his eyes gleamed through the darkness, piercing Joran's very soul. The silence stretched between them, thick with tension. "You've been seeking the truth," the priest's voice echoed through the chamber. It was soft, smooth, and cold. "But the truth is a poison, Joran. Once you taste it, you can never be free of it." Joran gripped the hilt of his knife, but his hand felt weak, trembling. "What have you done? What have you made me into?" The priest stepped forward, the sound of his footsteps resonating in the silence. "You were always meant to find this, Joran. You were always meant to be here, in the heart of the city. The Watchers have chosen you. The heart has chosen you." Joran recoiled, the words like a slap to his face. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind was spinning, swirling, drowning in the revelation. The Watchers, the heart. It's all part of the same thing. "You are the heart now, Joran," the priest whispered. the heart of the city, and now it is time for you to take your place, to take your power. Joran's vision blurred, his hands shaking, his breath quickening. It was true. The city had been waiting for him. He had always been part of it. The heart had never been something to destroy. It was something to become. The priest moved closer, his voice low and steady, but filled with an unsettling finality. Do you understand now, Joran? The city's power is not in the heart alone. It is in you, in your blood. You are the last piece, the final key to the eternal cycle. And now, the Watchers are waiting. They are waiting for you to join them. The city consumes. Joran staggered backward, his mind spinning, his body moving on instinct. The words of the priest seemed to reverberate around him, each one a hammer blow to his sanity. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The walls of the temple were closing in, the shadows twisting, the darkness pressing in on all sides. The Watchers, the heart, they've always been a part of me. No! Joran screamed, his voice rising in a desperate, primal cry. I won't be a part of this. But the priest didn't answer. He simply stood there, his eyes gleaming, waiting. Joran ran. He ran through the corridors, his legs carrying him as fast as they could, but the shadows followed. The walls seemed to stretch and twist, the passageways growing longer, narrower, as if the city itself were changing, shifting to keep him trapped. The city had always been alive, but now it felt aware of him, aware of his fear, his resistance. As Joran reached the exit of the temple, his mind became a blur of panic. The whispers were deafening now. The walls were closing in. The city had him. It had always had him. The only question was whether he would succumb to its embrace or fight until there was nothing left of him but ashes. The night swallowed him whole. End of chapter 8. This chapter 8 deepens the psychological horror surrounding Joran as he grapples with the realization that he is inexorably bound to the city's dark forces. The atmosphere is oppressive, building to a climax of terror as Joran is faced with the ultimate truth. He is both part of and prey to the very heart of the city. The chapter ends on a cliffhanger, with Joran's escape from the temple leaving him consumed by the all-encompassing terror of Zatan'nataz. Chapter 9. The weight of the truth. The city had become a labyrinth of darkness, its walls pressing in from all sides, its streets twisting and shifting as if they had a will of their own. Every corner, every alley, every shadow felt alive, suffused with the same heavy energy that now clung to Joran's very soul. The city had changed him, had bound him to its twisted heart in ways he could not understand. He had once been a man of reason, a man of action. But now, with every step he took, it was as though his grip on reality was slipping, piece by piece, like sand falling through his fingers. The whispers were constant now, faint murmurs that seemed to come from every direction, from the very ground beneath his feet. The words were always the same, echoing in his mind like a broken chant. You cannot escape. You belong to the city. You are one with the heart. The Watchers have chosen you. Joran had stopped questioning his sanity. He had stopped wondering if he was losing his mind. The truth was undeniable. He could feel it, thrumming through the air, vibrating in his bones. The city was alive. It had always been alive, but now it was aware of him. It was watching him, guiding him, suffocating him with its presence. And worst of all, it was inescapable. He had tried to run, tried to flee the heart of the city, the epicenter of the darkness that had claimed him. But every time he thought he had found an exit, every time he thought he had left the shadows behind, they crept back into his mind, into his thoughts, like an infection that would never heal. The whispers followed him, even in his dreams, twisting and turning, becoming louder and more insistent, until he could no longer tell where the city ended and his mind began. Joran wandered through the streets, his steps slow, deliberate, but heavy. He had no particular destination in mind. He didn't need one. The city was his destination now. He was walking through it, yes, but it was also walking through him. The pulse of its dark heart beat in time with his own, and he could no longer ignore the fact that the city was him, and he was it. There was no escaping that truth. His eyes flicked to the faces of those around him. They were the same people he had seen every day, people he had once known and trusted. But now, their faces were blank, empty. Their eyes were vacant, lifeless, as if they were nothing more than puppets. They moved with the same mechanical precision, their bodies jerking in time with the rhythm of the city. There was no humanity left in them. They were simply vessels, shells of the people they had once been, waiting for the city to use them once more. Joran's throat tightened as he walked among them, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. He didn't know what he was looking for, didn't know what he hoped to find. There was no escape. There was only the city, and it was closing in on him, wrapping around him like the thick fog that rolled in at night, blurring the edges of everything, obscuring the world until all that remained was the suffocating grip of the truth. He reached the edge of the marketplace, where the ancient stone walls of the city seemed to breathe, where the very earth seemed to hum beneath his feet. The scent of incense and decay lingered in the air, thick and sour. It was the smell of the city's secrets, of the sacrifices made long ago, of the power that had bound the people to the heart for centuries. It was a scent that made Joran's stomach churn, that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. He stepped closer to the great stone gate that marked the boundary between the heart of the city and the unknown depths beyond. The gate was tall, imposing, its surface covered in strange symbols, runes that seemed to shift and writhe when he looked at them, as though they were alive. They were the same symbols he had seen etched into the walls of the temple, the same symbols that had once seemed so foreign to him, so full of mystery. But now they seemed familiar, like a language he had always known, like a truth that had been buried in his soul. The gate creaked open before him, as if it had been waiting for him all along. The air beyond it was colder, the darkness deeper. It was a passage, a threshold, and Joran could feel it, the pull, the presence, the inevitable descent. He stepped through without hesitation, his legs moving on their own, carrying him deeper into the belly of the city. The passage was narrow, winding, the walls slick with moisture. The air grew thicker with each step, and the faintest sound of drips, like water falling in the distance, echoed through the stone. It was the sound of something ancient, something alive, feeding on the city, feeding on the darkness that had taken root in its heart. Joran didn't know how long he had been walking. Time had lost its meaning. Every step was a weight, every breath a struggle. The walls seemed to close in on him, and the further he went, the more the whispers grew, until they became a cacophony in his ears. They were no longer words. They were voices, millions of voices, crying out, begging for release. You cannot escape. You belong here. The thought echoed in his mind, clear and undeniable. The truth, the city, the heart. They were all the same, and now that he had uncovered it, there was no going back. Finally, he reached the end of the passage, a heavy stone door blocking his way. The door was ancient, its surface scarred with age, and it seemed to pulse with a dark energy. Joran could feel it, deep in his bones, the power radiating from it. The door was the gateway, the final threshold. Beyond it lay the heart, the source of all the city's power. And he knew deep in his soul, that once he crossed that threshold, there would be no returning to the world he had once known. The door opened with a groan, and Joran stepped through into a vast open chamber. The air was thick, humid, and the stone floor beneath his feet was slick with some unseen substance. The chamber was dimly lit, the flickering light from his torch casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to move on their own, like sentient things. At the center of the room lay the altar. The altar was massive, its surface dark and slick, and on it lay the heart, the demon's heart. It pulsed with a slow, rhythmic beat, as though it were alive, as though it were breathing. The sound of its pulse filled the room, growing louder and louder until it was the only thing Joran could hear. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't think. The heart called to him, its rhythm matching the beat of his own heart, its presence filling the room with an unbearable weight. The air was thick with its power, and Joran could feel it, deep in his chest, in his bones, in his blood. It is time, the voice in his head whispered. Time to take your place. The voice was everywhere, in the air, in his thoughts, in the very walls of the chamber. Joran felt it, the pull, the hunger. The heart was not just an object, it was a force. and now it had claimed him. His legs moved on their own, taking him toward the altar, toward the heart. He reached out with trembling hands, and as his fingers brushed the surface of the heart, a surge of power shot through him, coursing through his veins, filling every part of his body with an unbearable heat. "You are the heart," the voice whispered, its tone dark and triumphant. "You always were." Joran's vision blurred, his body convulsing with the force of the power that now flowed through him. The chamber around him seemed to warp, the walls bending and stretching like they were made of smoke. He was no longer sure where the city ended and he began. The power of the heart, the pulse of Zatan'nataz, was inside him now. The city had claimed him, and there was no escape. End of chapter 9. In this chapter 9, the horror intensifies as Joran reaches the heart of Zatan'nataz, both physically and metaphorically. The tension builds through his encounter with the heart, which seems to consume him, binding him to the city in a way that's both terrifying and inescapable. The psychological horror of losing himself in the city's embrace reaches its peak here, setting the stage for the next inevitable steps in his journey. The lines between reality and delusion blur more with each passing moment, leaving Joran trapped in the city's power, with no way to break free. Chapter 10. The Final Awakening. The city was no longer a place. It had become a prison, a labyrinth with no exit, its walls closing in on him at every turn. Every step Joran took felt like a descent deeper into the darkness, into the cold, suffocating heart of Zatan'nataz. The whispers that had once been faint and distant now echoed in his ears, filling his mind, drowning out the world. The truth was unbearable. And yet, it was all he could see now. You are one with the city. He heard it in the rustle of the leaves outside his window, in the flickering light of the lanterns on the street, in the soft rhythmic pounding of his own heart. The city was speaking to him. It had always been speaking to him, guiding him, pulling him closer to the truth. But now, the city no longer felt like a place he inhabited. It felt like something that had inhabited him, its dark, twisted essence now seeping through his veins, taking root in his bones. The boundaries between himself and the city had eroded, and Joran wasn't sure where he ended and the city began anymore. He had tried to fight it, tried to reject the truth, but there was no escaping it now. The heart, the demon's heart, was not just a source of power. It was the city's very soul, and now it was a part of him. Its pulse throbbed in his chest, its beat matching his own. Every breath he took felt like a surrender. Every thought he had seemed to slip further away from him, consumed by the power that flowed through the city's veins. Joran couldn't remember when the whispers had started. They had always been there, just at the edge of his awareness. But now they were everywhere. They didn't just come from the walls or the shadows anymore. They were in his mind, in his thoughts, in the very air he breathed. The truth had become his reality, and reality, he realized, was a fragile thing. It was something that could break apart and shatter at the slightest touch. The worst part was the growing sense of inevitability that had taken root in his soul. He had tried to resist, had tried to break free, but the city had him now. He was no longer just a man who had uncovered the truth. He was part of it. He was part of the city's heart, its pulse, its hunger, and there was no escaping it. The echoes of the Watchers. Joran wandered through the streets in a daze, unable to focus, unable to think. The city had swallowed him whole, and every step he took felt like a slow surrender. It was as though he was walking in a dream, everything around him distant and blurry, the faces of the people passing by nothing more than vague, empty forms. Their eyes didn't meet his anymore. They didn't see him. They couldn't. They were part of the machine, the puppet show that had been orchestrated by the Watchers, by the ancient forces that had always controlled Zatan'nataz. The Watchers. The words echoed in his mind, sharp and painful. He had learned of them in pieces, whispers from the shadows, fragments of knowledge that had slipped through the cracks of his understanding. They were not human. They were not even alive, not in the way Joran understood life. They were something else, something older, something that had existed long before Zatan'nataz had been built. They were the true rulers of the city, the ones who had always controlled it from the shadows, manipulating everything, everyone, for their own purposes. Joran had thought the priests were the ones in power, but he had been wrong. They were merely the pawns. The Watchers had always been the ones pulling the strings, and now they had claimed him. He stopped in the middle of the street, his heart pounding, his mind spinning. He could hear them now, the whispers growing louder. They were in the air, in his head, in every shadow. The Watchers were calling to him, beckoning him forward. You know what you must do, Joran. You know your place in the game. The city is waiting for you. The words were clear now, direct. They weren't just thoughts anymore. They were commands. Joran's pulse quickened as the weight of their meaning sank in. He had always known there was something darker, something hidden beneath the surface of Zatan'nataz. But now it was all coming together. The heart, the Watchers, the city itself. They had always been connected. And now, he was part of it. No, Joran thought, shaking his head as if to rid himself of the voices. I don't want this. I don't want to be a part of this. But the voices only grew louder, more insistent. They pressed against his mind, filling him with a cold certainty. He couldn't fight it. He couldn't escape. The door opens. Joran found himself standing before the massive stone door to the pit of Zakas once more. The door had opened before him, just as it had all those days ago when he had first entered. But this time, there was no fear. There was no hesitation. He was no longer afraid. It was as though the door had been waiting for him. It had always been waiting for him to accept what he had become. The door creaked open with a heavy, resonating sound, the thick darkness beyond it beckoning him forward. Without thinking, Joran stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something darker, something more primal. It clung to him, seeping into his skin, his clothes, his very soul. He could feel the pulse of the city in his veins, in every beat of his heart. It was alive, and so was he. He had always been alive. But now, that life felt different. It felt connected to something far greater, something far older. The chamber was vast, the shadows stretching high above him, disappearing into the darkness. The altar stood at the center, and there it was, the heart. It was pulsing, its rhythmic beat resonating in the chamber, in the walls, in the air around him. Joran reached out, his hand trembling, but there was no fear now. There was only the pull, the draw of the heart, the call of the city. It was his now, his heart, his city. He was part of it, and there was no escaping that truth. His fingers brushed the surface of the heart, and in that instant, the power surged through him, filling him with a cold fire that spread through his veins, igniting every part of him. He gasped as the vision hit him. A flood of images, of memories, of knowledge that wasn't his own. He saw the city's history, its rise and fall, its blood-soaked past, and the Watchers who had always been there, pulling the strings, controlling everything. The truth was here. It had always been here, and now Joran understood. He understood that the city was not just a place. It was an entity, a living being, and it had always been alive, feeding on the blood of the people, on their fear, on their devotion. And now, Joran was part of that life. He was a thread in the web that had been spun for centuries. There was no escape from it. He had always been part of the city. He had always been part of the heart. The heart pulsed once more, and Joran felt it. Felt the city choosing him. The Watchers had chosen him. The city had claimed him. And there was no turning back. End of Chapter 10. In Chapter 10, Joran finally accepts his role within the city, embracing the truth that he is bound to Zatan'nataz and its dark ancient power. The chapter delves into his internal struggle and eventual surrender to the city's all-consuming influence. The heart of the city, its dark force, has claimed him, and he realizes that escape is no longer possible. The psychological horror intensifies as Joran's connection to the city becomes both inescapable and inevitable. Epilogue. The city's will. The city had been waiting for him, and now, as Joran stood at the heart of Zatan'nataz, he finally understood the true nature of the beast that had always haunted his steps. There was no escaping it now, no freedom left to him. The truth had been revealed, but it had come at a price he could never have imagined. The heart pulsed before him, its dark energy thrumming in the chamber, filling every corner with a power that he could feel in the very marrow of his bones. It was the source of everything: the city's power, the priest's control, the whispers that had followed him all his life. It was all one entity, one force, feeding on the fear, the worship, and the blood of those who had given themselves to it, willingly or not. And now, Joran was no different. He had fought it, he had tried to resist, but there was no resisting the inevitable. The city had chosen him, as it had chosen so many before him. He had uncovered its secrets, but in doing so, he had bound himself to it. There was no escape. He was part of it now, woven into its dark fabric. The heart was no longer just an object. It was a force, an extension of the city itself, and he had become its vessel. "You are the city," the voice whispered in his mind. "You have always been." The words were a comfort and a curse. They were both a revelation and a prison. The city had been alive all along, a living thing that had grown and fed on the blood and fear of its people. The truth was simple, yet horrifying. The city was not a place, not a collection of buildings and streets. The city was a consciousness, a creature with a mind of its own, manipulating the lives of those within it, guiding them, using them. And it had always been like this. It was not the priests who controlled the city. They were just its puppets, as much a part of the game as the rest of the citizens. Joran could feel it now, the city's pulse beating in time with his own heart. It was in the air, in the very stone beneath his feet. It was in his thoughts, his dreams, his soul. There was no going back. The Watchers had claimed him, just as they had claimed the others before him. And now, his role was clear. He was the heart's new guardian, its new vessel. The city would use him, just as it had used all the others, until he was no longer human, until he was no longer Joran. He turned slowly, his body moving on its own, as though the city was pulling him, guiding him. The chamber around him seemed to stretch and contract, the walls shifting like the pulse of the heart itself. He could hear the whispers now, louder, more insistent. The city waits. The Watchers are pleased. The truth is complete. Joran's eyes darted around the room, but there was no escape. The chamber was closing in, the walls growing tighter with every passing second, like the city was folding in on itself, suffocating him. But it wasn't just the chamber that was closing in. It was the world itself. The city was taking him, wrapping its tendrils around him, pulling him deeper into its grasp. And he was powerless to stop it. For a moment, he thought of the people, the ones who had lived their lives in ignorance, unaware of the truth that had always been under their noses. They had worshipped the goddess, prayed to her, believed that they were safe. But they were just as much a part of the lie as he had been. They were puppets, dancing to the tune of the Watchers, unaware of the strings that controlled them. They were no different than Joran had been, and now neither was he. Joran took a step forward, his body moving as if it were no longer his own, as if it were being guided by something far older, far darker. The city had claimed him, and there was no escaping it now. He was one with it, as much a part of it as the heart that pulsed before him. As he moved, the walls seemed to shift around him, and the chamber darkened further. The air grew cold, and the whispers faded into the background, replaced by a deep, resonant hum. The pulse of the heart was deafening now, and Joran could feel it reverberating through his very soul. The Watchers were here. They had always been here, waiting for him to understand his place in the game. And now, they had him. They had always had him. He reached out with trembling hands and placed them on the heart, feeling its power course through him, filling him with an icy fire. It burned, but it was the kind of burn that felt like home, like an old wound that had never healed. And in that moment, Joran understood. He wasn't just part of the city. He was the city. The pulse of the heart grew louder, its rhythm aligning with his own heart, its energy flowing into him, filling him with its dark power. He was no longer Joran. He was part of something far greater, something far older. He was a vessel for the city's will, a force of nature that could not be denied. And as the power surged through him, he realized with a cold, detached clarity that he had been chosen all along. The heart's rhythm quickened. The city was awakening. It was time for the watchers to see. It was time for the city to rise. The end of the story. This ending brings the narrative full circle, showing Joran's complete transformation from a man seeking the truth to a vessel of the city's malevolent will. The horror is not just external, it's internal as well, as Joran's own identity is consumed by the city he tried to uncover. The final moments emphasize the inescapable nature of the city's grip and the cost of knowing the truth. Total surrender to its power.